It was a Sunday morning bathed in golden, cinematic light. On Celadon Avenue, a street that seemed curated for postcards, the world felt soft and slow. The air, a delicate blend of fresh-baked croissants and blooming magnolia, drifted from open doorways. At the corner sat the Gilded Mug Café, a haven of polished glass and warm wood, its patrons a quiet murmur against the clink of porcelain. Inside, at a small marble table by the window, Elena Seagal was a portrait of tranquility. She wore a simple white linen dress, a stark contrast to her dark, flowing hair which she'd loosely pinned up. A novel rested in her hands, its pages turning with unhurried grace. The sun warmed her shoulders, and she took a slow, deliberate sip of her herbal tea, lost in the fictional world before her. She possessed an elegance that didn't demand attention, it was innate, a quiet confidence that radiated from within. To any casual observer, she was just a beautiful woman enjoying a moment of peace. But she wasn't just anyone. She was Steven Seagal's wife. Today, she believed she was alone. But across the street, parked discreetly, was a black SUV with windows so dark they mirrored the sky. Behind the wheel, Steven watched her, his presence a silent, protective shield. He'd arrived early for their planned lunch. This quiet hour at the cafe was her ritual, a space she carved out for herself, and he respected it deeply. But respecting her space never meant leaving her unguarded. He felt a familiar calm watching her, a sense of rightness in the world. That calm was about to be shattered. The peace was ripped apart by a sound like tearing metal, the guttural roar of 3 custom motorcycles. They thundered down Celadon Avenue, their noise an act of vandalism against the morning's quiet. Conversation in the Gilded Mug faltered and died. Heads turned. The very air grew tense, heavy with a new, unwelcome energy. Leading the trio was a man who seemed carved from concrete and contempt. He had a shaved head, a thick, braided beard, and a pair of ice-blue eyes that scanned the street with predatory ownership. His leather vest was emblazoned with a coiled, rusting serpent and the words "Rust Vipers." This was Jax. His reputation for casual brutality preceded him wherever he went. Flanked by his 2 lieutenants, hulking figures of tattooed muscle, they killed their engines, the sudden silence somehow more threatening than the noise. They strode into the cafe's patio area, their heavy boots scraping offensively against the pristine flagstones. A young waiter, barely out of his teens, approached them, his smile trembling. "Table for 3. Jax ignored him, his cold eyes sweeping over the patrons until they landed on Elena. He saw her elegance, her composure, the way she didn't even grant him a glance. And in his twisted worldview, her lack of fear was a sign of disrespect. It infuriated him. "Who does she think she is?" he grunted to his cronies, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Look at her, boss." "High class," one of them snickered. Jax's lip curled into a sneer. "I hate snobs." From the SUV, Steven's eyes narrowed. His hand, which had been resting on the center console, moved instinctively to the door handle. He saw Jax get up, not with a coffee cup, but with a small, metallic flask he unhooked from his belt. He began walking toward Elena's table, his movements a slow, arrogant swagger. Elena finally looked up from her book, her expression calm but a flicker of caution in her eyes. She could smell it now, not coffee, but a sharp, chemical tang underneath his cheap cologne. "Morning," Jax drawled, his voice a low growl. "Looks like you could use some company to warm you up." Elena closed her book, marking her page. "I'm quite fine, thank you. Please go back to your table." He leaned closer, invading her space, his shadow falling over her. "Don't be like that. We're just being friendly." Her brow furrowed with controlled annoyance. "I've asked you politely. Please leave." The cafe had gone completely still. Jax's face twisted into a mask of pure malice. "You think you're too good for me?" He looked down at her simple glass of water, then at the flask in his hand. He unscrewed the cap. "You need to learn some respect. And without another word, he flung the contents of the flask across the table. It wasn't hot. It was cold, shockingly so. A clear, viscous liquid splashed across Elena's white dress, soaking her chest and lap. She gasped, jerking back not from heat, but from the sudden, nauseating stench of gasoline. Patrons recoiled in horror, chairs scraped back, a woman screamed. The immediate, terrifying implication hung in the air: fire. There, Jax laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. Now you've got my attention. He turned to walk away, triumphant. But he didn't get 2 steps. Part 2, the storm arrives. Behind him, a shadow moved with impossible speed. The door of the black SUV had flown open the instant the gasoline left the flask. Steven Seagal wasn't running, he was flowing, a current of pure, condensed fury moving across the street. The cafe's glass door slammed open against the wall with a deafening crack, announcing his arrival like a thunderclap. Jack spun around, his arrogant smirk dissolving into confusion. Who the hell are? He never finished the sentence. Steven didn't speak. He was a hurricane with a heartbeat. In a single, fluid motion that seemed to defy physics, he closed the distance. His hand shot out, not in a punch, but with open fingers, latching onto the collar of Jax's leather vest. There was no struggle. With the force of a battering ram, Steven propelled him backward, slamming him against the cafe's solid brick wall. The impact was sickening. A spiderweb of cracks appeared in the plaster behind Jax's head. The metal flask clattered from his limp hand and spun across the pavement. Steven leaned in, his face inches from the bikers, his voice not a shout, but a low, razor-sharp whisper that cut through the shocked silence. You just threw gasoline on my wife. Jax coughed, his eyes wide with stunned disbelief and pain. I didn't know she was. I don't care what you knew. Steven's voice was devoid of all emotion except for a chilling, absolute certainty. He released Jax, but only for a fraction of a second. As the biker stumbled forward, disoriented, Steven drove a perfectly placed elbow into his ribs. The sound was a dull, wet thud, like a sledgehammer hitting a side of beef. All the air exploded from Jax's lungs, and he folded in on himself like a piece of cardboard, collapsing to the ground in a heap. His 2 cronies, frozen for a heartbeat, finally snapped into action. Jax, one yelled, charging forward with a wild, telegraphed punch. Big mistake. Steven pivoted on the ball of his foot, letting the punch sail harmlessly past his head. As the biker stumbled off balance, Steven met his chest with a powerful palm strike. It wasn't a push, it was a concussive blast of force that lifted the man off his feet and sent him crashing backward through a large terracotta planter, showering the patio with soil and shattered pottery. The third biker, seeing his 2 leaders neutralized in under 5 seconds, made a smarter, though equally futile, choice. He tried to run. He didn't even make it to the sidewalk. Steven lunged, his hand clamping around the man's fleeing arm. With a swift, economic twist of his body, he executed a perfect hip throw. The biker was airborne for a moment before landing flat on his back on the hard pavement with a grunt that signaled his complete and utter defeat. Silence descended once more. Less than 10 seconds had passed. 3 large, armed men were on the ground, groaning, gasping, and utterly broken. The storm had passed as quickly as it had arrived. Part 3, Aftermath and Escalation. Steven stood over them, his breathing even, his suit unruffled. He turned his attention immediately to Elena. She was on her feet now, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the dark, spreading stain on her dress. She was shaken, but her eyes held a core of steel. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice now gentle, the storm receding to reveal the man she knew. She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. The smell. It was just. "I'm fine. Just scared." The distant wail of sirens grew closer. Across the patio, the initial shock of the patrons was morphing into something else. Phones, which had been frozen mid-air, were now all pointing in one direction, their red recording lights blinking. The entire, brutal takedown had been captured from at least a dozen angles. The footage was already being uploaded, stitched into the digital fabric of the internet. Headlines were being born in real time: Steven Seagal destroys thug who doused his wife in gasoline. A police cruiser screeched to a halt at the curb. Two officers emerged, one young and tense, the other older, with weary eyes that had seen too much. This was Sergeant Miller. His gaze took in the scene: the three downed bikers, the shattered planter, the silent crowd, and Steven Seagal standing protectively beside a woman reeking of gasoline. "Sir, what happened here?" Miller asked, his tone professional but his eyes betraying his assessment that this was no ordinary brawl. Elena spoke first, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor in her hands. "That man," she said, pointing a resolute finger at the groaning Jax, "threw gasoline on me. Because I wouldn't talk to him." Sergeant Miller's expression hardened. He knelt beside Jax, sniffing the air. "Gasoline? Are you out of your mind?" he growled. He looked back at Steven. "This is assault with a deadly weapon. Attempted, at the very least." He understood immediately. This wasn't about a spilled drink. This was a threat of horrific violence. Jax, clutching his ribs, could only manage a pained snarl. She was asking for it, acting like a... She was asking for nothing. Steven cut in, his voice flat and cold. "Men like you don't stop at gasoline. So I stopped you." The officers exchanged a look. No cuffs were placed on Steven Seagal. Instead, Jax and his crew, now officially suspects in a serious felony, were hauled to their feet and shoved into the back of the cruiser. As the car pulled away, the patrons of the Gilded Mug erupted into spontaneous applause. Hours later, in the sanctuary of their hilltop home, the scent of gasoline had been replaced by chamomile and clean air. Elena sat on a plush sofa, wrapped in a soft cashmere blanket, a mug of tea warming her hands. Steven sat beside her, a silent, powerful presence. "I can't get the smell out of my head," she whispered. She flinched when he used a remote to turn on the television, the small click sounding too much like a lighter. He noticed, and his jaw tightened. "I'm sorry you went through that," he said, his voice thick with a rage he kept tightly leashed. "I'm just glad I was there." "Me too," she said, managing a faint smile. His phone buzzed. It was a text from an old friend in the LAPD. "Heard what happened? Be careful. Jax's crew posted his bail. High-dollar lawyer. He's out." Guys like that, with that much humiliation, they don't just walk away. They get stupid. Steven read the message, his expression turning to granite. He looked out the large picture window at the sprawling city lights below. It wasn't over. The public fight was finished, but the private war had just begun. Part 4, Midnight Vendetta. 3 nights later, the Seagal property was an island of tranquility under a moonless sky. But inside the house, there was no peace. Steven wasn't sleeping. He sat in his darkened study, the only light coming from the bank of high-definition monitors displaying feeds from the perimeter security cameras. He had sent Elena to stay with her sister upstate, telling her he needed a couple of days to handle some business. She understood without needing to ask. He watched the screens like a panther observing its territory, patient and utterly focused. At 2:16 a.m., it happened. A flicker of movement on camera 7, near the main gate. A dark shape, low to the ground. He keyed in a command, and the system isolated and enhanced the image. A motorcycle, its engine off, coasting silently down the access road. No license plate. Then another. And a third. He stood up, his body moving with a silent economy. He was not surprised. He was prepared. Jax, Tug, and Nico crept up the long, winding driveway. They were bruised, bandaged, and fueled by a toxic cocktail of painkillers and impotent rage. They thought they were predators, moving under the cloak of darkness to exact their revenge. They thought the house would be asleep, vulnerable. They planned to send a message of fire and fear. They were catastrophically wrong. They reached the large cobblestone courtyard in front of the house and dismounted, pulling weapons from their jackets. Jax brandished a heavy steel crowbar. Tug gripped a tire iron. The third biker flicked open a switchblade, its blade gleaming faintly. "Time to pay the piper, old man," Jax whispered, a vicious grin splitting his face. "I was hoping you'd come," a calm voice said from the shadows of the grand entrance. "It saves me the trouble of finding you." Steven stepped out of the doorway. He wasn't wearing a suit now, but simple black training clothes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't take a fighting stance. He just stood there, an immovable object of consequence. The sight of him, waiting for them, calm and ready, shattered their confidence. For a terrifying moment, they saw this not as a revenge mission, but as a trap they had willingly walked into. Jax recovered first, his rage overriding his fear. With a guttural roar, he charged, swinging the crowbar in a wild, horizontal arc aimed at Steven's head. Steven didn't retreat. He flowed forward, ducking under the clumsy swing. As the crowbar whistled over his head, he swept his leg out, catching Jax behind the ankles. With his momentum already carrying him forward, Jax had no chance. He went down hard, his head connecting with the flagstones with a sickening crack before he tumbled into a row of manicured hedges. Tug swung the tire iron like a baseball bat. Steven sidestepped the blow, the iron pipe clanging uselessly against the stone steps. Before Tug could recover, Steven seized his wrist, twisting it in a way that bone was not meant to bend. Tug screamed in agony as Steven used his own momentum to slam him face first into the heavy stone fountain in the center of the courtyard. He collapsed, unconscious, into the shallow water. The third man, seeing his partners dispatched in seconds, lunged desperately with the switchblade. Steven met the attack with a precise block, deflecting the blade arm outward. He spun, trapping the man's arm, and drove him forward, headfirst into the solid oak door he himself had just exited. The man slumped to the ground, the knife skittering away into the darkness. It was over in less than 30 seconds. Silence returned to the courtyard, broken only by the gurgle of the fountain and Jax's pained groans from the bushes. Steven stood over him, his breathing perfectly steady. "You could have learned," he said, his voice like chipping ice. "You could have taken your beating, served your time, and learned. But you came to my house." He leaned down. "That was your last mistake." As if on cue, the night was torn apart by the piercing wail of sirens, growing closer with astonishing speed. Red and blue lights flashed at the bottom of the driveway. Steven had triggered the silent alarm the moment Camera 7 picked them up. This wasn't a fight. It was an extermination. Part 5, Resolution and the New Peace. The arrival of the police was a formality. They found 3 battered, armed men sprawled across a pristine courtyard and Steven Seagal standing calmly, without a single scratch on him. Sergeant Miller, leading the response team, just shook his head, a look of weary resignation on his face. "Some people never learn," he muttered. The consequences this time were absolute. With evidence of trespassing, conspiracy to commit assault, possession of deadly weapons, and violating their bail conditions, Jax and his crew were denied any chance of release. The judge, seeing the clear pattern of escalation, threw the book at them. The headlines wrote of a 5 to 7 year sentence, no possibility of parole. But the truer punishment came from the world they inhabited. The story of the Rust Vipers, a gang so inept they were twice annihilated by one man they had targeted, became a legend of ridicule in the criminal underworld. Humiliated and leaderless, the gang dissolved into nothing, its members scattering to escape the stench of failure. They weren't just inmates, they were a punchline. A week later, the sun was once again warming the patio of the Gilded Mug Cafe. Steven and Elena sat at the same table, This time, the atmosphere was different. A discreet but well-built security guard stood near the entrance, a new addition. The cafe manager had personally greeted them, insisting their meal was on the house, a gesture of gratitude from the entire community. Elena sipped her drink, a tall glass of iced tea. She smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile. "It's peaceful again," she said. "For now," Steven replied, watching the street. She reached across the table, placing her hand on his. "Do you think they learned their lesson?" Steven considered it for a moment, his gaze profound. "They learned that actions have consequences," he said, his voice low and certain. "And some consequences are absolute." Across the street, a family waved. A young boy pointed, his face alight with awe. "You're a real superhero," he shouted. Steven offered a rare, small smile and a nod, then turned his focus back to the only person in the world who mattered. He looked at Elena, the warmth in his eyes chasing away the last of the shadows. Justice wasn't about punishment. It was about preserving peace. And his peace was sitting right in front of him. This story shows that true strength lies in protecting what we love. But what do you think? Was Seagal's response justified, or did it go too far in the end? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's have a thoughtful discussion. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories where justice is served. Always comment with respect.